Hey there, I'm Caleb Brown, a programmer, marketer, and product person here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I'm starting a new series where I kind of brainstorm an idea. It can be digital or physical, from concept all the way to actually having that tangible product. But to set the stage, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about me. This idea came from the fact that I wish that I had been doing more documentation for prior products. So I thought that I would tell a couple stories about products that I built in the past and show you as much from behind the scenes as I possibly can. I've built an educational bookmarking service that's used by over 100,000 educators. I created what I believe is the first loose leaf tea subscription service, and that was backed by Gary Vaynerchuk. Most recently, I launched a clothing service that is kind of like Stitch Fix, except everything is secondhand, and so we're way more affordable. But to set the stage, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about me, some interesting stories from when I was in high school, like this video, getting a cease and desist letter from a multi-billion-dollar company before I could even drive. I'll tell you about flying out to San Francisco when I was in college to be interviewed by Y Combinator. That's one of the biggest startup incubators in the world that has backed companies like Reddit, Airbnb, and Coinbase. And I'll tell you a little bit about the first time I met Gary Vaynerchuk, moving to New York to work for VaynerMedia, and tell you all about the process of Gary angel investing in Handmade Tea, my loose leaf tea subscription service. Since it's a story time, we're gonna be drinking a beer. This is General Braddock's IPA from the Brew Gentleman in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Our story begins in central Pennsylvania. I'm from a very small town, but always was interested in tech and computers. I actually thought that I was gonna go more in the hardware direction than software, because when I was a kid, I'd go to yard sales with my mom and use my allowance to buy, telephones, TVs, radios, whatever I could, bring them home, take them apart, usually accidentally destroy them. I wasn't good at this, but I was very curious about the inner workings of all of this stuff. So that's kind of been in my DNA from early on. Super nice IPA. I've had it before, I haven't had it in a while. Really smooth, mangoey, that big, juicy citrus fruit, but super chill. I really like this IPA. But yeah, that love for tech just never went away, really. I think I was in like 7th or 8th grade and I begged for a Palm Pilot for my birthday. The handspring visor specifically, and the translucent orange. Had a little module that you could like add a digital camera to it. So it was my first digital camera. It took I think it could save like 20 or 30 color images and they looked like shit. It was really awful, but it was my first digital camera and it was so cool that this little device in your hand could do all of this. But so let's get into some juicier stuff, right? So, I'm loving the internet, right? We get dial-up. It's not even cable modem stuff yet. We're using dial-up, and I'm so curious about the internet and how all of this works, right? So interested in how computers talk to one another. That leads me to some seedy sides of the internet, some hacking groups, hacking forums, things like that. I learned about these kind of freeware pieces of software where you can scan IP addresses and look for vulnerabilities. So I'm learning about how IP addresses work and how you can kind of trace back an IP address. I could basically figure out the block of IP addresses that my ISP was using at the time. So I started to scan these blocks of IP addresses because I was curious about how an ISP works. So I remember one day, this was the summer, and this was all I was doing as just a curious kid. I find a web server run by the ISP that has an open web port, 8080. And that was always exciting because that meant that you could actually plug it into your web browser and see something, right? And that was cool, and you kind of knew that you weren't supposed to be there, right? So I noticed this is a log file that's tracking every time someone logs in. Essentially, every time someone successfully dials up, it would show their username, and then it would show asterisks beside that for their password. However, if they type their password incorrectly, it would show you in plain text that password. This log file was not behind any kind of password. They just didn't expect anyone to find it, I assume. I already had credentials to get onto the internet, so it really wasn't all that helpful to use someone else's credentials. Again, however, beside that, it showed you their user status, their level. And most folks were, I don't remember what the term was, but user, normal, whatever, they were a consumer. Every once in a while, you would see admin. And from, continuing to dig around, I knew there were some sites that the ISP were running that you couldn't access with just normal credentials. So most of these admins were typing their password correctly. Good for them. However, again, I was just a nerd and was watching all of this all summer. and eventually picked up about 3 to 5 admin passwords. And it was pretty easy to see when someone put the wrong password in what the problem was, right? Like if it was all in caps, they just had their caps locks on, or if there was an extra keystroke at the end, a random period or slash, they just hit something before hitting enter. So you could usually pretty easily figure out where they made the mistake. And if you were me, you would keep that password so that you had it. So now that I had these admin passwords, I actually could access some of these web pages that I had found previously that were properly, secured behind a username and password that needed to be admin level privileges. That's when me, in whatever it was, 8th or 9th grade, got into that, and that's the first time I saw something about the credit card processing. And I noped the hell out of there. I knew that I had gone too far. I was seeing way too much. I'm a minor, so we're good now. If you're watching this, you don't do this. No matter how old you are, don't do this stuff. There's plenty of resources out there now on YouTube and Wikipedia to learn about this stuff. I didn't have that, and I just had to kind of hack my way through it. Don't do this. So shortly after that, I did receive an email from my ISP saying, please stop what you're doing. And luckily that's all that it went. And I did do that. I never did any of that ever again. So we didn't have any issues, but I wasn't trying to hide my identity. I wasn't doing this through a proxy server or anything like that. It was just, I thought if they were this level of unsecure to show their full log files, that no one would even be watching it. And I was wrong. They were watching me. So I never mess with the ISP again, right? Lesson learned. Kind of. Around that same time, maybe a year or so later, my high school upgraded our locking system. Like they used to use physical keys that the teachers would have. They upgraded to RFID. I'm sure at this point you know what RFID is, radio frequency identification, a little card, you hold it up to the thing. If you're authorized to enter that door, it unlocks. Well, this had my little nerdy brain going absolutely wild about how RFID worked, how there was not a battery in this card, but you could hold it could retain information. Blew my mind. So I spent a lot of time learning how RFID worked. And from this research, I realized something really interesting. And I'm sure this has changed years later. But at the time, they couldn't store that much information on the card, right? They could only store a little bit. There was a unique ID or a unique number for every teacher, and it basically said if that teacher was allowed to have access to that particular door. But it had to store it in plain text on the RFID card because there wasn't room for encryption. That meant you could certainly spoof a card pretty easily, read the contents, write it to another one. But what I was more interested in was a box that would brute force through all of these numbers until it got one, so it would hit you with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 until one matched a teacher's ID. They just assumed that people wouldn't make copies of these cards. They wouldn't brute force their way through. So while I never built this product for real, I started putting together what one would theoretically need to make it. Again, I didn't know hardware stuff, but I knew enough, and I started researching kind of physical hardware parts, what could output on that RFID frequency in a microcomputer that could just constantly churn through numbers. And eventually I got something that was literally the size of a matchbook that I thought would work. And so I put those theoretical plans. Luckily I saved some images. We'll throw them up on the screen here. But I threw that up on like an Angel Fire site or something like that, just thinking I would maybe share it with other nerds or really just put it out there for myself. But in about 3 days of posting just to a random Angel Fire website, I unfortunately got a very, very strongly worded email from the company. I can't remember who it was from. I can't remember if it was from a lawyer or whatever. But they were telling me to cease and desist, that if I did not bring the website down, that we would go to court. Was not prepared to do that. Not the hill I was going to die on. So I did remove the website. And they seemed really chill after that. And in fact, it's not one of the stories where they offered me a job, but they did tell me to hit them up after I graduated high school to tour the campus there. I think they're in Chicago maybe. And I never did that, but I think that was actually pretty cool of them. Now let's wrap up with a more wholesome story. The story about the first program I ever wrote, the first real code I ever wrote. Prior to this, it was just all HTML, things like that. Some folks might not remember the era of AOL Instant Messenger. In 2003, 4, 5, AOL Instant Messenger is how you talk to everyone you wanted to talk to back then. I did not have a cell phone yet. I didn't get a cell phone until I went off to college. college. AOL really the lifeblood of communication in high school. In a situation I was running into, I would hang out at a friend's house and, nothing was in the cloud back then. There was no cloud. So your messages that you would get if you were at someone's house, the messages you would get, the new ones at your computer, could only be seen on your computer, right? You couldn't access them elsewhere. So if you were, maybe really hoping that your crush was going to message you that day, but you were at a friend's house, you would want to see if you had any new messages. So I built something in Visual Basic. I called it Dear Oscar. Oscar was the protocol that AIM used for communication. It was Open System for Communication in Real Time is what it stood for. And so what Dear Oscar did was simply every 5 minutes would look at your log file to see if it had changed. And if it had, it would read those files and send it out to the email address that you had already given Dear Oscar. Pretty simple. Then all you had to do is check your email at a friend's house and see all of your new AOL instant messages. But that opened me up to the world of programming, really, of consumer products, of building stuff that wasn't illegal. And that really kind of changed. Like I said, I thought I was going to go into the hardware direction because I thought hardware was really interesting. Hardware is interesting. But software, there was so much opportunity to get your work in front of people and to help people in so many different ways. So I just feel that I was really lucky there. A lot of people get out of high school, enter college, not really knowing what they want to do, getting into a major that really isn't for them. And so I feel really lucky actually that I was able to jump into college as a computer information systems major, and that has worked out for me. So I hope this helped kind of set the stage on who I am. The next episode is going to be really fun because it's going to be all about me kind of falling in love with the Web 2.0 era. There's going to be plenty of nostalgia. My first product in college was a way for people to watch movies for free, legally, before streaming existed. So stick around, like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.